Hello, my name is Liz Ndoye, and I'm here to do the next lesson in the Art at Home series sponsored by the Hoboken Public Library. For the month of August, we are going to be doing a whole series of projects on the theme of summer vacation, because this is the time of year, if we were not being locked down because of COVID-19, we would be doing typical vacation things. We are first going to look at a variety of paintings by different artists. Today I'm going to be teaching you how to do a landscape in watercolor paint. While we're looking at the paintings that I'm going to show you, I'll talk about different ideas and techniques that you can use and that the other artists use to create their landscapes, and then you'll be ready to go to create your own beautiful summertime landscape. It's been very, very hot, so this will be a little bit of stay at home, stay at your table or desk type activity that won't generate a lot more sweat. It's just going to be fun, fun, fun. This is a painting by Claude Monet. It is an oil painting, and I think it's quite a wonderful landscape for us to start with because it has all the classic things in it that I can talk to you about to help you create your own beautiful landscape or waterscape. The first thing that I want to mention is that every landscape painting should have what we call a horizon line. So the horizon line separates the top from the bottom of the image and also the background from the foreground. The foreground is the part of the painting that is in the front, usually bottom for the most part, of a landscape. Some other things to pay attention to. When you do a landscape, the larger shapes are always in the foreground. So for example, this foliage here, even though we know in our minds that the leaves are quite small, in relation to the spire of this cathedral or church in the background, appear much larger. The reason this is what artists do, it's a device and a technique that artists use, is because it helps to create what we call depth of field. It forces the mind's eye to move back towards the horizon line, back into space. That creates the illusion of reality and depth in your painting. So the painting goes from being something two-dimensional and flat into becoming something more realistic with depth and greater dimension. Notice also that the sailboat closer to the foreground and beneath most of it is beneath the horizon line. It is way larger than this very large cathedral on the horizon line. And again, that is because Monet wanted to create the illusion of depth and the surrealistic quality of being able to move back into the actual image that you're looking at. Another thing to think about when you're doing landscapes or seascapes for your summer vacation painting is color. For the most part, you will find the brighter, more intense colors in the foreground or front of your painting. If you think about this in terms of real life, when you go for a walk, things that you see up close to you are way more colorful than things that are way off in the distance. And even though Monet, who was quite famous for his use of color, even though he uses quite a bit of color in the background and above the horizon line of this painting, they are not that bright. So they are dulled down, they are grayed down, because colors far away in the distance usually are like that. Some other things to note about this particular painting is the wonderful texture that Monet has used. Something else that you might want to employ in your own work. The textural quality of his work has enabled him to make a much more detailed foreground. You may be able to notice the small black dots on the cathedral back in the background that represent windows in the church, but you can actually see every blade of grass in the plant life in the foreground or front of the painting. And that is because those objects to the viewer are closer. The things in the background are further away, and you can see less texture and less detail. All right. This painting is another Impressionist painting. I failed to mention that Monet was an Impressionist painter. And you'll notice that the image is quite blurry. Don't worry about that. Impressionist paintings tend to be blurry. One thing more that I want to mention to you about landscape work in this painting is the quality of dark and light in landscapes. For the most part, you will see your darkest darks, like the umbrella and this woman's black dress, this woman's black hair. Those very dark colors will be in the foreground or front of the picture, and usually your brightest, lightest colors will be up above. There's a lot of sunlight on this woman's dress and on the edge of this chair, but that is reflected from the sky. So if you keep in mind that the brightest colors are usually up above in the sky, that's a very good rule to follow. I love this painting because it really shows beautiful depth of field. Notice the way the lines go back to the horizon line. That too creates an illusion of space. Larger objects, these women are quite huge. Larger objects always are in the foreground. Look at the size of the women compared to this gazebo or structure on the horizon line. They are so much larger in comparison, and that's the trick that works best when you're trying to create a realistic landscape. Keep those big shapes in the front, tiny, smaller shapes in the background. William Turner was a wonderful landscape artist, very different style from the other paintings we've looked at so far, way more realistic. I like this painting because it really conveys a lot of information about the time of day at which the artist was working. You can see there are very, very deep shadows. Shadows are a great thing for you to use to create this more realistic image in your landscape, if that's what you want to achieve. Notice how the horse is in bright sunlight and is extremely bright. Unfortunately, probably the image you're looking at now is a little too blurry to see, but there's extraordinary detail in the horse because the horse is in the foreground. You can actually almost see each hair in the horse's mane and tail, and that kind of detail really helps to achieve a realistic image. And again, details would be much more obvious in the foreground or the front of the painting, much less visible in the background of the piece. Again, notice The trees are quite huge compared to everything in the background back here by the horizon line. And again, that's a trick, a technique that artists use to create this feeling of depth in a painting. I'm not sure what time of day this is, but I'm guessing it's close to midday. That's why there's such bright sunlight and such deep shadow. I'm thinking that there must be, out of our vision, either a very tall building or a large mountain that's covering the trees in the foreground in shadow. It's a really wonderful image. Notice how as the animals go back down this pathway here, they get increasingly smaller the further away they get, and the duller in color that they get. This painting too is a great example of how the colors along the horizon line are very gray and very dull, and the colors in the foreground are deeper, richer, and intense. The darkest darks are in the foreground, the brightest lights are up in the background in the sky. It's a wonderful image. This is one of my favorite Claude Monet paintings. He was an Impressionist painter, which I neglected to mention earlier on, and his imagery is quite blurry when you're up close and personal with it, and that's part of what the Impressionists did. They really wanted the observer to stand back and look at their work from a distance, and when you do that, when you're viewing an Impressionist painting, the blurry things solidify and come together. So their idea, their whole purpose was to capture an impression of what they were looking at, particularly the lights and darks that they were viewing, and the time of day that they painted their paintings was also extremely important to them. Monet quite famously painted the Rouen Cathedral, or was it Chartres? I'm not remembering right now, but he painted it at multiple times of day, and you can look at those images and see how the colors change depending on the time of day when you're viewing what you want to paint. I love this painting too because it really, even though it looks almost abstract and there's not a whole lot of shape imagery going on, if you are able to see in the foreground, the bottom part of this painting, even the marks that he used to create the wavelets and the ripples in the water are larger and deeper in intensity as far as color goes in the front or foreground of the painting. As you recede back into space, you see fewer and fewer of those lines demarking where the ripples in the water are, and the colors get much more gray as you get further and further back. I'm not sure if it was a stormy day or if it was near sunset, but Monet did this interesting trick of putting the darker shadows underneath the clouds here. That too creates an illusion of depth and three-dimensional quality to this painting. There's also a very, very teeny speck. I love that he did this way on the horizon in the background. Probably a ship sailing along the horizon line. And to the viewer on the shoreline, it's barely visible at all. Doing that kind of thing is what makes your landscape or seascape look really, really realistic, because it makes it look like you're virtually traveling far back into space. Wonderful. For me, this painting is almost magical. I love the subtle colors. I love the kind of stormy quality to it, all the action and motion in the textural effect that he created. Now I'm going to talk briefly about the materials that I'm going to use for the seascape that I'm going to create. And I've chosen to do a seascape rather than landscape because I'm definitely an ocean person, and my favorite place on earth is Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Really love the beach up there. First of all, I'm using watercolor paints, as I mentioned earlier, and I prefer watercolor paints come in cake media, dry cake media, and they also come in tubes. I prefer using the watercolor paint that's in tubes. This is a set that I purchased from Dick Blick, and they are Winsor Newton paints. I recommend Winsor Newton brand. It is the best watercolor paint that I believe you can get in the US. It comes in millions of colors. Some colors are more expensive than others. You're going to have to research that, find out what colors appeal to you, and stock up on those. But you can also get them in kit size like this. You can get them with fewer colors or more colors. I have laid out my paints on a palette and a brief review of the color wheel for those of you who have not had a lesson with me before. There are three primary colors. They are blue, yellow, and red. Neither of these are a true red, so you're going to have to imagine. But it's important to know about the primary colors. Primary colors you can only get out of a tube or a jar of paint. You cannot mix them. So they are primary, they are key, they are essential to your work. Again, they are blue, red, and yellow. And the wonderful thing about primary colors is you can mix all of what we call the secondary colors. They are colors that are made by mixing two primary colors together. So for example, blue with yellow creates green. Red with yellow creates orange. And finally, blue with red will give you violet. And you can make a red violet with more red and a blue violet with more blue. You can make a warmer orange with more yellow and less red. And you can make different shades of green by using more or less blue or yellow. All right, I have brushes of a variety of sizes. Large brushes you will need for your background and the larger shapes, obviously. And then some smaller brushes for doing detail and outline work. Small brushes come in a variety of shapes. Actually, so do the large ones. You can get square brushes or rounded pointy tip brushes. You can get them extremely fine point and as big as house paint brushes. I also have paper towel and tissue, not just for wiping up my mess, but they are great for cleaning off your brushes and also for creating and making different textures in your painting, which I will show you momentarily. And of course you need water because you're using watercolor paint. Also have a pencil. I believe in sketching very lightly what you're going to create first. Very, very lightly when you're using watercolor paint because it's transparent. And once you've done the sketch, you begin the painting. Focusing in on my hands now so that you can actually see the way I'm going to set this up. I can't actually work on the easel behind me because the paints are liquid and they will drip. But I'm hoping by the time I complete this piece, I can put it on the easel so you can see it. Or by the time I've done a lot of work on it, you can see it on the easel. To start with, we need our horizon line. Again, lightly in pencil. The horizon line, I mean, you could put it right in the middle of the top and bottom of your painting, but you need to determine what is most important to you in this picture. Do you want it to be things in the foreground or things in the background. That will help you figure out where the horizon line will be. If you want more space in the front, obviously you're going to put your foreground higher up on the paper, etc. All right, I've got my horizon line. I think I'll probably have a few clouds in my seascape. Our friend, other art teacher Bob Ross, he liked to make his happy little clouds. I'm going to make some too. Lightly, quickly sketched in pencil. And perhaps we'll put a boat here in the foreground. I'm thinking the Hudson Clearwater sloop. So there's going to be a giant mast. And part of the boat is extending right off the edge, the outer edge of the picture. You'll be able to see it when I put this up on the easel, and that will help to make an image that has a bit of motion and movement to it. Okay, some sail, the jibsail, and the big sail. I'm going to erase part of the horizon line so it's not going to be visible through the sails that I've just drawn. All right. Watercolor artists like to create what we call washes. My favorite way to do a wash, and washes can be done really quickly, particularly on a hot, humid day like today. You want to work fast. I like to literally soak the paper with the biggest brush I have available. I've saturated my paper, and I'm going to just start with a tiny bit of color. We call this dropping in the paint. Now things are going to become more visible for you. The beauty of watercolor is it moves. Water flows. It goes where it wants to go. And for me, personally, in my own work, that's a freeing thing. It relieves me of some responsibility in trying to control everything in the picture. And I love that. For those of you who've never used watercolor paint before, practice, experiment, try and enjoy allowing the paint to flow where it wants to go. I'm using straight blue at the moment, but I will be mixing soon. I think using the paint directly from the tube is not going to give you a realistic, natural palette. So I rarely like to use pure color. I like to mix. But for starters, when I'm laying down the wash, it's not as crucial. So now I'm laying in the wash for the water. And remember, the colors are always grayer by the horizon line. I'm mixing my blue with a tiny bit of a brownish red color, and it is making the blue less bright and more gray. But then as I get to the front or the foreground, I'm using brighter color. Do it quickly before the water dries out. The darkest darks are in the foreground. The brightest brights are in the background and the sky. And just a note about clouds, I leave white spaces in watercolor paintings white and dry. You can get white watercolor paint. I personally don't like using it. I don't think it helps or creates a natural image. If you want to lighten your colors in watercolor paint, you just add more water. Okay, do a little bit of work on the hull of the ship. I'm mixing brown with a little bit of green. Let's see what happens. Kind of like it. Now, in this part of the painting, I used a little bit less water. If you want your colors to be darker and more intense, you're going to use less water. So the hull is now blocked in, the mast. One thing you want to be careful of, if you make mistakes in your watercolor painting, don't try and go back and fix them or cover them up. You're just going to run into more problems and create even more disasters for yourself. Again, try and let the watercolors do what they will do. Let them have their way. So the sails of the boat, I'm leaving white. And now I'm going to show you how you can use the tissue. So the tissue or paper towel is great for creating textural effects. If you have an area in the painting that's dark and wet, you can crumple up the paper towel and dab with it. And it makes some really beautiful textures. I love doing this. So now also we're at the stage in the painting where the paints are a little bit drier and you can start adding detail. Notice I've switched from the larger brush to a smaller one, and I'm defining certain parts of the painting. As usual, I'm not going to have time to finish this, to show you the finished piece, but my goal is to give you enough information to get you started on your own. So now we have an example of how to start your watercolor painting. This is far from finished. I would like to let the paper dry a lot more before I start adding more details to the wash. You can see though that I've started to define certain areas with some line work, some darker edges to things, and once the paper is drier again, you can do more of that and add more details. So your assignment for this week of Art at Home is to, I recommend you look through old photographs of vacations that you've taken, find a shot of nature that you really like, and do it. You will want to take a moment before you start creating the image to frame in your shot how much of the landscape or seascape you want to create. One of the hardest parts of determining what you're going to paint in a landscape is how much of the scene that you want to look at and recreate. So make those decisions first. If it's not a glossy photograph and you're not worried about destroying the image, you could even lightly pencil in the area on the picture that you want to recreate. So in closing, I want to again thank the Hoboken Public Library. They are so generous in allowing us to continue art at home during the time of pandemic. There are many lessons in the series of Art at Home lessons starting way back in March when the lockdown began. If you're interested in viewing more of those, please do visit the website at hobokenlibrary.org to find them. And in the meantime, as always, art on. Be as creative as you can. Enjoy, have fun, and see you next week.